And if we allow the federal government to continue to foster a policy that will erase these this evidence of injustice, then it's a partial history. And it puts us back into a posture where we have to fight all over again to have the African American experience recognized and the experience of oppression inside the country recognized more generally. We'll be
Right.
back into a more defensive mode about things that we've worked hard for over the last generation or two.
Hello, Imuna listeners. We're so glad you have joined us today because we have a special guest, a distinguished, prolific scholar of African American history with a specialty in urban labor. Welcome, Dr. Joe William Trotter Jr.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Trotter is a professor of history and social justice at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He's known for a lot of things, including some powerful books that we will discuss in another episode. Today, I just want to talk to Dr. Trotter about his overall work, his journey from the beginning to where he is today. So, Dr. Trotter, you were born in McDowell County in southern West Virginia, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Tell us about your childhood and how that influenced you.
Okay. That's an excellent question. I like to reflect on my West Virginia days because I see West Virginia as having been sort of the foundation of my life because I really stayed in West Virginia with the family until I was 16 years old. So I spent 16 years in that cold town called Balls Creek, West Virginia, in McDowell County. And by the way, McDowell County is actually the county that is southernmost in the state.
Mm.
You can't get any closer without being in Virginia. So we were right on the Virginia line. And the interesting part is that in our school system, we were closer to a high school in West Virginia than some of the residents of Virginia were to their school. So we had some residents from Virginia attending our high school.
Uh-huh.
But just to get back to the origins, I grew up in a coal mining family. My father was a coal miner all of his life, most of his adult life. And my mother was the mother of 14 children. I'm number six in that order.
Wow.
And I have 10 sisters and three brothers. And so that really shaped me is being able to grow up in a family with that many um, family members meant that you were constantly in some kind of conversation and contention and so on within the household. And it was an enriching experience, but it was also a poor experience. We were um, 14 in a four-room house.
Wow.
But the truth is, we had such an age spread that there were never more than 12 people in the house. So that made a difference. And so, um, and so in that kind of household, you came to see, life in a real intimate way, how you have to share resources, food, clothing, all of that. And so that was a formative experience for me. But I think that equally important, going to school was exciting to me. I
Mhm.
was interested in school from day one and wanted to go to school earlier than my parents could allow me to go.
Right.
But finally, I was able to go to school, and we were in segregated schools in West
Right.
Virginia.
Right.
West Virginia is a unique state, as you know. It seceded from Virginia and decided to stay in the Union during the Civil War. And so the Black experience in West Virginia is pretty unique, an experience that I learned a lot more about the history of the place that we lived in after leaving West Virginia than I did while I was living in West Virginia. And
Wow.
in fact,
Okay.
I learned much more as I researched my second book on African Americans in Southern West Virginia, where I grew up. And
Uh-huh.
so I would just fast forward to my high school years and just say that um, I was planning to be a brick mason. I went to a trade school called the UH Prunty Trade School in a town called Welch, West Virginia. And the way that worked is that those of us who were going into a vocational track, we would spend half of our day at the vocational school, and then we would spend the second half at the high school where we were enrolled. And that high school was called Excelsior, West Virginia High
Okay.
School. And
Mhm.
it's interesting because we had the name Excelsior. The white school was called Big Creek. And believe me, when the schools integrated, well after I left, they took the name Big Creek. Can you imagine that
I know.
name, Big Creek, sort of trumping Excelsior? And we'll get back to that term later in some conversation we're gonna have. But anyhow, I I had friends. One named Italy Carrington. I remember him very well because he was kind of a model along with my cousin Pete. But and both of them were interested in bricklaying, and so I decided to pursue the bricklaying track. And so that may account for some of my interest in building, like
Mhm.
building the Black City.
Oh, right, right, right. Yeah, that's great. That's great. And you in other conversations I've read and seen in some videos that you have taped, you talk about your father and how he influenced you. Um, as
Yeah,
a deep I'm sorry, as a coal miner, he
yeah,
deeply shaped your sense of purpose.
yeah.
What did you learn from watching him work that later became the foundation for your scholarship?
Yes, my father was important in my life, and I think in all of our lives. He was the breadwinner. I mean, my mother never worked outside the home. In West Virginia, very few women who were married and had families worked outside the home. And so he was a male role model of a man who would take care of his family, work hard, and do what was necessary to put food on the table. And in many cases, because we were poor, we didn't always understand that the food we got was hard earned through
Mhm.
his labor within the mines. And I never got a chance to actually go into the mines with him. That would have been prohibited for a child to be brought into the mine. But I did come to see, and through conversation with him and through other members of the community, that was some difficult labor, and we all knew that was back-breaking and muscle-building labor because my father's body was extraordinary in terms of build because he was loading tons and tons of coal by hand, and
Mm,
that was becoming unusual for the mines. By the time um, there's a story about the heyday of coal mining, and then there's a story about the decline of coal mining and the way in which these men were unemployed and displaced by mechanization. But
mm,
for the most part, my father was a hand loader. And what interested me most and the way I model him most is that he was a very enterprising man. I mean, he was a barber at home on the side. He was also a man who owned a truck, and he would haul people and things back and forth. He was a scrap iron collector,
wow.
and so I saw him working in all kind of ways. And as a child, I started to develop. Well, first of all, a child wants to impress their parents, so I would try to do things around the house that would make him proud and my mother proud, and to work. So working was always part of my my motivation coming up. I
Mhm.
wanted to work as much as I could, and so I ended up doing various things that young people would do. In fact, I carried the Pittsburgh Courier. I sold that paper in the mountains of West Virginia when I
Wow.
was a young person. Um, but the interesting thing is that I tried to sell that paper to white people as well, but they weren't buying it. And they would say, "You got a grit?" A grit paper was that white paper that was, sort of working class oriented, family fun paper. I
Mhm.
said, "No, but I can get it." So I started carrying two paper bags on my arms, and one was for white folks and one was for black folks. um, so
That
um,
is enterprising.
yeah, so I worked that, and to tell the truth, Tamara, in those days, bootlegging was still very prominent, even though making alcohol was no longer prohibited. Prohibition was long gone, but people continued to make moonshine. And one of the ways young people got money was to gather up whiskey bottles, clean them up, and take them to the moonshiners. And I was able to do that, and they actually said that I was a pretty decent bottle producer, and so I would do that. So yeah, so just doing different things um, it was part of that work ethic. Um, but then after my family moved from West Virginia, I could no longer do the bricklaying part. So that's this is the West Virginia episode.
Okay, okay. Was there a moment from your childhood that still stays with you?
Well, my father's death.
Oh,
I was 12 years old when he um, was the victim of a homicide, and
no.
I never, it's a experience you can never quite come to grips with fully. And
Yeah.
I have a brother named Otis Trotter who wrote a memoir, his own memoir, because he was born with congenital heart disease. And he managed to survive partly because my family moved us to Ohio, where he got much needed medical care that he couldn't get in West Virginia. And so,
Mhm.
so that really affected me in ways that lasted for a long, long time. For example, my father was only 43 years old
Mhm.
when he was killed. And I somehow always saw him as a model, and as a young person, I started to become a little bit, you might say, fearful of life, thinking that maybe I wouldn't make it much beyond, my early 40s. So I didn't really plan on a long lifetime. And by
Mm.
the time I was in my early 40s and going into my mid 40s, I said, well, maybe I am going to live through this. I had to figure out how I'm gonna spend the rest of my life. But by then, I was out of graduate school, and I knew that I would need to do things over a lifetime. So I started to think about a vision, for the future,
Mhm.
beyond the 40s, and but that was a lasting impression. But the other thing about my father, besides his death that impacted me, came through my mother after
Mm.
he passed away. And even as I grew into my later teens, she shared with me, because we were poor, none of us expected to go to college. We were expected, or the men were expected, to pretty much go into the military. So I had scoped out that I would be a brick mason, but I would go into the Air Force upon graduating from high school.
Mhm.
But she told me that my father had shared with her that he believed that his son should get higher education.
Wow.
He wasn't so sure about his daughter doing it because he thought they could marry well and men would take care of them. That was the motto in his head, that he
Mhm.
was going to take care of his wife and his family, and that his daughter should be able to marry and their husband should be able to take care of them and their families. So he was very emphatic about saying his son needed an education to get out of the coal fields because there's no future here, that type of thing. And that really motivated me a lot once
Mhm.
I heard that story about, you know, doing the best that I could do as a student and preparing myself. But still, I never prepared myself for college. I never did see that as until late in high school as a career possibility.
Wow, wow. And at what point did you realize your work as a historian was more than academic, that it was a mission to make the Black working class visible and valued?
And that's an excellent question. I like to talk about that because um, for me, research in the Black working class did, in fact, become a mission, much more than just an occupation and a profession. And I think the change came for me is when I got a degree, undergraduate degree, BA degree in history and education, and I taught high school for 6 years. And during my 6 years teaching high school in a small town called Kenosha, Wisconsin, the home of American Motors, the old American Motors. Um, During those years, I had never taken a history course in Black history. I had taken history, a lot of history course, but never took a Black history course. And so during those years, I really started to reading and teaching myself enough history of the Black experience that I could create a course at the high school called, Black History, something like that.
Wow, you created a course.
I taught a course, but I created the course and I prepared for the course on my own, and
Okay.
and the school accepted it into the curriculum.
Wow.
Um, but on the other hand, my main job was to teach the U.S. history course
Okay.
and the world history course. And in those courses, I was emphatic on exposing students to the African American and African experience
Mhm.
because those items were missing from most of the textbooks that we were instructed to use. In fact, school boards, they selected what textbooks you were going to use. And so I found myself supplementing the text so heavily that it started to become an issue for some of the white students because I was reinterpreting the history of the country through the lens of how slavery, the African American experience, and all of that shaped what America became.
Right.
And so, because I didn't have the definitive textbooks to refer to, I could see, and most of my students, by the way, were white. I had a few Black students in that town, but most of them were white. I could see the skepticism. um, why do you feel that what you are able to put together, that's not in the textbook, is the truth, or at least a fuller truth than the book that we are studying? And so I had to really come to grips with the idea that I was not a trained historian in the Black experience, and that in order to really push the agenda, I really did need to go back to school, and I wanted to then enrolled in a graduate school so that I could get a degree, a PhD degree, and I could really have the tools to write textbooks that could be used in high schools and other schools around the country. That was part of my mission there, to
Wow.
do that. And,
Wow.
the truth is, going to graduate school is not the way you learn how to do a textbook, because that's the last thing they want you to do is they want you to become a historian. And what that means is that you are going to become the creator of new knowledge in the field by systematic and painstaking research. And if you just want to write textbooks for high school students, then you don't need to go to graduate school to do it. You just need to be able to, maybe a master's degree would help, but a
Mhm.
PhD is not the place for somebody who just wants to write textbooks. And so
Mhm.
I decided, yeah, I do want a PhD, and I do want to be able to write books if that's in in my future. But I never
Mhm.
thought that it would be the primary thing that I would do. And so as a graduate student, when I finally enrolled, it began to dawn on me that there was another kind of history, not just a Black history that I need to come to grips with, but another wave of historical scholarship more broadly that sort of connected with some of my interests in African American history.
Mm,
And so when I went to graduate school, it was all about the African American experience. I want to study the African American experience. And when I got there, I found out it was a welcoming place. I went to the University of Minnesota. It was a welcoming place. And it was a welcoming moment in the field of history because by that time, white historians were beginning to talk about crafting a history from the bottom up instead
mm,
of the top down. And so they were talking about America needing a reinterpretation from the vantage point of people who really fundamentally built the country, workers in all kinds of industries, construction, steel, rubber, automobile, all across the board. And so I was really interested in that because Black people are heavily working people, and so um, but um, but let me just say, Tamara, what really got me to the working class dimension of that is that too often in the writing and discussion of the historical experience of Black people, people were treating anything you wrote about Black people as history from the bottom up because we were supposed to have been a submerged race, right?
right,
We at the bottom of the racial scale, and
right.
therefore, if you work on Black folks, you're doing history from the bottom up. But then, as I looked deeper into the experiences of Black people, I understood better that no, not all of Black history can be framed around race, that within the African American community, there were dynamics of class taking place at various levels, and that if we ignored that, we were going to miss a lot of the African American experience. And so I started to see that much of our writings would, in fact, privilege the most accomplished among us, doctors, lawyers, scientists, people who were making stellar accomplishments and contribution, but
Mhm,
at that upper level that required, in many ways, college and educational training. And
mhm,
so I started to think that we're shortchanging the people who are doing some of the most basic work that's fueling the development of the country: coal miners, lumber workers, steel mill workers, all of these people. And Black people were heavily and disproportionately represented
mhm,
among those people at the bottommost um, um, ladders of the country. And so
mhm,
that got me to see that this is this can't be just a part-time job. Uh, Bringing working people, Black working people, to the forefront of the way we understand African American life is going to be an ongoing enterprise. And
mhm,
so I have to be committed to the ideal that I can't write just one or two books and have like that will be my contribution. That would be the end of the day. I
mhm,
needed to sustain over a lifetime um, some substantial work in the field to help broadening the foundation, for Black um, labor and working class history. And so uh, after sort of getting into the field of historical scholarship. And I got my first job in 1980 at the University of California in
mhm,
Davis.
mhm,
And and then my book came out in 1985. So from about 1985 on, I knew that I wanted to really delve deeper into the Black working class experience, which I had done in Black Milwaukee. It is considered to be one of the foundational books in Black labor history today.
mhm,
And so I built on that, and I decided to do a study of Blacks in West Virginia in the coal mine.
mhm,
It's sort of s- an honor in honor of my father and my family and my own history, but it was also framed as a study that academic professional historians could appreciate and that would meet the standard, so to speak, of historical writing and research. And so, in a way, I wrote that book in a very specialized, narrow chronological frame that even talked about the Black experience there before my family migrated there. And so,
Okay.
what was interesting about that, though, is that I learned that McDowell County in southern West Virginia was in many ways an inspiring beacon of hope for a
Wow.
lot of people. To give you
Mhm.
one example, by 1921-22, there were three Black legislators in the state House of Representatives in West Virginia.
Wow.
And not only that, they introduced bills like an anti-lynching bill, which passed in West Virginia,
Yes.
that
Yes.
punished or at least called for the punishment of people who lynch a person, and deprive them and their families of their livelihood and labor. And so, and then there was another law that they managed to pass in the wake of the birth of a nation that prohibited the showing of inflammatory films
Wow.
and writings. And so I said, look, this is a history that needs to be brought to a broader audience. And so writing about West Virginia for me was really important. And by the way, one of those men in the legislature was a coal miner. And
Wow.
so, and
Okay.
the others are lawyers, attorneys. And
Uh-huh.
so, we have that kind of history. But I do think that maybe one other major thing that I learned that I had not known is that West Virginia never disfranchised Black workers and Black people.
Hmm.
Black people could vote in the state from the end of the Civil War pretty much until now.
Yeah, I
Um,
was surprised when I read that. Yes.
yeah, that is what happened there, and it did mean that the alliance with the Republican Party in West Virginia was built heavily on Black support.
Uh,
And that's why you got West Virginia State University, Bluefield State, and there were a couple of other institutions of higher learning, like
mhm,
Storer College. I don't know if they still exist, but those institutions were a product of Black political organization
mm,
and the ability to make demands on the state to really take um, an interest and do some concrete things for the Black population.
mhm, mhm. Um, Now, your work does challenge the idea that Black urban communities were broken or accidental. What is the most misunderstood truth about how the Black city was actually built?
Okay, excellent question. Again, you raised good questions, Tamara. Thank you. That one I like because I think the most misleading thing that exists around the notion of a Black city is that people find it very hard to conceptualize Black people as city builders. We have been conceptualized in all kind of ways, right? We are ghetto dwellers, right? We're
Mhm,
slum people. We live in slums. We're downtrodden people exploited at the bottom of the workforce. We're the most unhealthy, sick people. We
mhm,
are everything,
mhm,
but
mhm,
city builders.
mhm,
And then when you look at it, it's almost like people prefer to front load all of the ways in which we have been exploited, discriminated against, and disadvantaged. There's a tendency to want to foreground that history
mhm,
because there's an agenda about making the country sensitive to the injustice and the necessity of bringing about change. And so that sort of undermines the capacity of people to see people who are victimized that way as energetic, creative,
mhm,
enterprising, productive, and builders of their own community
mhm,
against the odds.
mhm,
And so that's one of the things that I think is so striking. And that's one of the things that I was hoping, and I'm still hoping, that the book will call people attention to the idea that it is not going to undermine our case for reparations by showing that Black people were able to double tax their labor to build something for themselves that was their own creation. And also, it allows us to see how even modest home building, modest church building, modest, you know, institutions speak loudly about the
Mhm,
accomplishments of
mhm,
Black people.
mhm,
And so I think that when we look, and for example, too often historically, even professional writers have really criticized the Black community for being church builders, proliferation of churches everywhere, on every block. And then they see that as a deficit
mhm,
rather than a benefit. And so even the great creativity that Black people are exhibiting in creating these institutions to serve communities that feel the need for that institution, they're diminished. And
mhm.
so if we don't start conceptualizing African Americans as people who can conceptualize and build a life of their own through their own labor, their own activism, then we're missing a big part of the African American experience. And also, we're missing a big part of the rationale for why this system of inequality has to go. It
Right,
has to be diminished. Because the Black people have managed to do all of this against the odds,
right,
you know? And
right,
so it makes a case that we don't have to downplay our creativity because we're trying to make the case that we've been mistreated, right? So we need to bring that back up to the top,
mhm,
make people acknowledge it as another pillar of a case for reparation, a case for redress, a case for leveling the playing field, a case for diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? so, so
the
we,
bad word of the day.
yeah, and I know, just like affirmative action, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
what I'm trying to suggest here is that every time we try to deal with a system of inequality, sooner or later, those people who want to resist the movement are going to find a way to force us back and to
right,
force us to really reshift and reshape the way we think about and articulate the problem. And I want to say a little bit about that because I put that DEI out there deliberately because I know it's a bad word and that people are backing away. But what I'm going to say we need to historicize all of this, and
mm,
I think even as we fight for all of these things, let us acknowledge that we're dealing with a people who are very creative
yeah,
and can be justly called uh, city builders.
right. That comment just really segues nicely into my next question. Um, can you briefly discuss the current crisis facing scholars, teachers, and learners of the African American experience, and how your career as a professional historian fits into this struggle?
Okay. Well, that's a question that we all are grappling with now. And that is in March, Trump issued that executive order calling for the dismantling of all evidence of slavery, oppression, injustice, and the evidence that this country had fallen short on its promise as a democratic nation. He wants to remove that. And this most recent case is that just this year, this January, they dismantled that exhibit in Philadelphia,
Yes.
the president's house. That whole exhibit that had the lives of nine, I think it was nine Black people who lived in that house and worked for Washington during the time that he was president and occupied that residence. And they took that down. And with the ideal that it is putting America in a bad light and making America look oppressive, when in fact these enslaved people, or that exhibit has stories about these enslaved people. It humanized them in a way that slavery tried to dehumanize them. And
Right.
so that kind of information is critical to the understanding of the history of the country.
Mhm.
And if we allow the federal government to continue to foster a policy that will erase these this evidence of injustice, then it's a partial history. And it puts us back into a posture where we have to fight all over again to have the African American experience recognized and the experience of oppression inside the country recognized more generally. We'll be
Right.
back into a more defensive mode about things that we've worked hard for over the last generation or two. And actually, it has been an ongoing battle, Tamara, over and thinking about this talk, and I said, I need to say something about we've been here before.
Yeah.
This is not the first time that we've confronted the distortion of the Black past.
Right.
This is just the latest iteration of a movement to denigrate and undermine the achievements and contributions of Black people historically.
Right.
And I'm thinking back to reading more, as I got into the historical profession, I started to read a little bit more about the prehistory of the historical profession, especially the prehistory of Black historical profession.
Mhm.
And a lot of people don't know, but the historical profession is only some 150 years old or something like that. The
Mhm.
late 19th, early 20th century was the beginning of what we call the historical profession. That's when the journals were created. That's when the graduate schools were created. That's when they started training a generation of people who could research and write the history of the country and so on. But that whole beginning of the historical profession was grounded in the Jim Crow era, late
Mhm.
19th, early 20th century. For Black people, that was the nadir, right? That was what Rayford Logan called the low point. So
Mhm.
the historical profession rising when Black people as a people, in terms of their rights and their safety as human beings, are facing the lynch mob, disfranchisement, that whole litany of Jim Crow policies and practices that was
Mhm.
trying to confine us to a limited space within the body politic and the nation. And
Mhm.
so we had to fight that, right? Du Bois, um, Carter Woodson, and that whole cohort of first generation of professional historians, they had to fight that scientific interpretation of the Black experience at that time because
Mhm.
the racist perspective on Black history came about within that early body of writing about the American experience. It always marginalized and denigrated the Black
Right.
experience. Du
Right.
Bois and Woodson were talking about creating a history that acknowledged not just the suffering, but the contributions of the Black population. And so
Mhm.
we've fought this battle before. We just have to gear up, look at our history, and fight it again.
Amen. Amen. That's great. Um, Looking back, how do you define success? Not just in awards or books, but in what you've helped preserve for future generations.
Yeah, I like that question as well because I'm near the retirement age where I'm going to retire pretty soon, and I have been thinking about this a lot about how one want to be remembered, how one assess their contributions, and so on. And I think for me, uh, my success, I think, is going to have to be to what extent the students that I've taught over these many years have received the kind of teaching that I've been able to do and
Mhm.
how that has impacted their lives. Because I see that, and I've had graduate students and undergraduate students. And I think that as a single human being, one of the greatest accomplishments and successes is knowing that a lot of young people who are capable of taking this story into the next century even are out there carrying forward some of the insights that you believe are so important to our future. And so I
Mm,
think that would be the ultimate kind of success story.
okay.
But along with that, I would say somewhat subordinate to that, but close to the top, is that I believe that as a historian and as a creator of new knowledge, we have to keep doing it over a lifetime and actually keep doing it until we can't do it anymore. Because I think that the more we write and produce and put into the public arena that people can read and interpret, the more impactful our lives are going to be.
Mm,
And so I think that the body of scholarship that we produce as historians, as I know the quality is important, but we have to have the substance somehow. And that's why, there's a precarious balance when we're trying to produce something that can be deemed an excellent work, you know, and
mhm,
then some of us feeling that excellence so intensely that it's difficult to finish a work
mhm,
because, you're always looking to make it better. But I think that we have to do good, solid work and realize that we are here for only a moment.
yeah.
And so we don't want to, you know, squander any of this time. We want to make a contribution, put it into the public arena, let students take the baton and move it forward, and not worry as much as we are likely to do as professionals about always putting the work off, and then it becomes so yeah. So I think the productivity and the teaching and
Mhm.
all of that goes together in creating a successful career.
Great, great, great. Oh, this has just been so wonderful. Great conversation. Thank you, Dr. Trotter, for sharing with Imuna listeners today.
Okay.
And listeners, list three takeaways from our conversation with Dr. Trotter. Like, will you work to reframe the way we talk about Black cities? Or will you decide that you're going to join in this struggle to keep our Black history alive and vibrant and truthful? You decide, and then let us know. And with that, we say, live in victory.
Thank you.